Bartłomiej Kowalczyk, another Franciscan, but a friar minor, defended his dissertation again with Professor Craig Morrison at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in 2022, La Vetus Syra del Vangelo di Marco, and published it in the subsequent 2023. He teaches at Pontifical University of St. Anthony, Rome, Italy. He publishes in Antonianum, Liber Annum, Revista Biblica, and Enoch, and he will be presenting the paper titled Translations of the Verb Dei in the Gospel of St. John in Ancient Syriac Versions. Father Bartłomiej, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thanks for your invitation. I will share with you my desktop in order to make my presentation more comprehensible. So, just a moment. Do you see my desktop? Yes. Thanks.
Yes, yes, yeah, we can see
Okay.
it.
Yes, it is good.
I will like to begin with a short introduction. The concept of necessity sometimes poses challenging questions on a philological or theological level. For example, when the necessity concerns Jesus' passion. In reality, we are not the first to deal with that problem. Many ancient translators of the Bible already had to decide how to express the aforementioned concept in their languages, given that it was not always possible to translate the biblical text literally. In my presentation, I will briefly focus on the presentation of the verb Dei in John's Gospel in ancient Syriac versions, namely in the Old Syriac, in the Presider, and in the Harklean version. The following abbreviations will be used throughout the presentation: GT Greek text, S Syriac Sinaiticus, C Syriac Curetonianus, and P Peshitta. The text of the Old Syriac has not been completely preserved. If the text of a particular biblical passage has not survived, I will indicate this using the word vacat. The Greek verb Dei. The Greek verb Dei is often almost automatically associated with the concept of divine necessity of Jesus' passion or with the concept of the history of salvation. Surely this association is correct in many texts, first of all in the Lucan narrative. However, in the New Testament, they can denote other types of necessity or obligation, for example, moral or religious obligations, the fulfillment of the scriptures, eschatological realities, obligations related to ordinary life. Before directly analyzing the Johannine text with Dei, it may be helpful to somehow anticipate some phenomena and allow the global perspective of its possible translations in Syriac. Three rather common and widespread choices of Syriac translators of the Gospel of John are Wole, Atit, and Tzadek. Let us now briefly look at these words and their meaning. The most frequent translations of Dei in the Old Syriac and Peshitta of John is Wole, described by J. Payne Smith as follows: the effective verb used impersonally with lamat. It is meet, fit, right, proper, convenient. It ought, it should, it must, it behoves. With lamat, the personal pronominal suffix I ought or must. Wolele, he must, wolelan, he must or should. It is therefore a verb with a very broad semantic field. This may explain its frequent use in the translation of Dei, given that both verbs Dei and Wole, have a rich semantic field. Whereas the significance of the verb Wole is quite clear and simple, the passive participle atit poses more challenges. The key issue is the following one. Does atit express only a temporal specification, future, prepared, or close to happen, and have also principally a modal value, it is necessary, must, or destined? Without claiming to deal with that problem in detail, it should be noticed that in recent years some authors, for example Morrison, Szymczak, and myself, have emphasized the modal aspect of atit in Syriac or in Aramaic. This form, at least in some texts, seems to be something more than a temporal marker. It may be useful to remember that in Syriac the future can be simply expressed by a participle or by the imperfect. An additional proof of this modal force of atit, as we will realize, is present in some texts in which atit is kind of plus addition. The third word to be discussed is the verb tzadek, usually impersonal. It is right, it ought, it is due. This verb translates all occurrences of Dei, the Harklean version, In truth, this phenomenon is not surprising if we consider the modus operandi of the Harklean version, which can be described as a kind of mirror translation, where the text is translated word for word. On the other hand, this way of proceeding makes the discussed version not very helpful for our analysis. For this reason, I will not include the Harklean version in my discussion of the single text. Finally, after these introductory notes, we can focus directly on the verb day and its Syriac translations. All occurrences of day in the Gospel of John can be schematically divided into categories that express in some way their meaning: religious obligation on the Christian existence, Jesus' passion, and Jesus' mission. It will be possible to discuss in detail all these texts, so I will limit myself to few texts with peculiar readings or translations of day. Afterwards, I will offer a short table aiming to illustrate the issue under examination in its entirety, and I will try to propose a kind of synthesis. Let us begin with John 4:20, where they regards the correct place of Jewish worship. I have decided to focus briefly on this text because its Syriac forms could be explained in many ways. This factor is not indifferent, above all when we try to catch the modus operandi of the version discussed. During the conversation of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, the question of the correct place of worship emerges. Where must people worship? The Peshitta offers a literal translation of John 4:20. On the contrary, the Old Syriac shows a peculiar form of text that references the house of worship and does not contain any element that expresses the modal value of day. What can be the source of this singular reading? Probably one has to exclude the Old Testament Peshitta, since this version does not seem to include, as far as I know, the syntagma bet secta. However, there exists another text that could have left its traces in John 4:20 SC, since the discussed reading appears in Ephraim's commentary on Tatian's Diatessaron. Finally, the actual shape of John 4:20 SC may show a certain tendency of the Old Syriac to simplify the text. The place where people must worship is almost like the house of worship. So it's not easy to explain the actual form of John 4:20 SC, as multiple explanations are possible. However, it is obvious that John 4:20 SC does not have the same modal power as its corresponding Greek text. Now I would like to discuss two occurrences of day linked to Jesus' passion. Let us begin with John 3:14. In John 3:14, the first occurrence of day appears, which defines the necessity of Jesus' passion. The Syriac Sinaiticus contains a particular construction that is chva plus lamat plus personal suffix plus lamat plus infinitive. How to interpret this translation? For Merz, this translation is ein Beispiel der Wortlichkeit. This statement is not convincing. Leon is right to criticize Merz. Considering the range of Sinaiticus translations of day, this does not seem correct. He uses chva plus infinitive only twice to represent day plus infinitive, here and Matthew 26:35. If he had wanted to be exactly literal, he would have used vole lemetteteramu berek denasha. And exactly this form is present verbatim in the Curetonianus. According to Leon, the translator of the Syriac Sinaiticus, I quote, had restructured rather than imitated the construction of the Greek. End of quote. This restructuring, considering Luzzaraga's observations, may be due to the influence of the first part of John 3:14s. By Kanadarim Kvamushe Hvaya Bematbeha. In this manner, we have some kind of parallelism, Arim Chva and Chvale. In Mark 14:31 SP and Matthew 26:35 SP, day is also translated, as you can see, with the verb chva, like in John 3:14s, although the constructions used in the text discussed are not exactly the same. In this three texts, however, day does not have the same shade of meaning, since in Mark 14:31 and Matthew 26:35, day simply expresses Peter's readiness to die with Jesus. So the text of John 3:14s appears as something unique. In John 3:14, the Peshitta translates day with atit. Is there something special in this choice? For Leon, wole and atit are almost common equivalents. Luzzaraga is even more radical, since he interprets the form atit in an exclusively temporal key. This last interpretation, however, seems reductive because it does not sufficiently consider the semantic richness of atit. The second day link to the Jesus Passion that I'm going to discuss is present in John 12:34. Starting from John 12:30, Jesus speaks about his death. Jesus lifted up from the earth will draw all people to him. In John 12:34, the crowd responds to Jesus and questions him. One of those questions contains the verb day, referring to the passion of Jesus. The Syriac Sinaiticus and Peshitta translate day with atit. In John 3:14, as seen before, Jesus has already predicted his passion in almost the same way. The only difference in the Greek text is the word order. The Peshitta, in both cases, uses atit for day, whereas the Syriac Sinaiticus prefers two different solutions, chva in John 3:14 and atit in John 12:34. This discrepancy alternates the textual link between John 3:14 and John 12:34. The last occurrence of day that I'm going to discuss in detail concerns Jesus' mission. On his journey to Galilee, Jesus must pass through Samaria. What kind of necessity is involved here? It can be on the one hand a geographical necessity, since Samaria is located between Judea and Galilee. On the other hand, a theological necessity, since in this manner with Jesus, the evangelization of Samaria will begin. This issue is not easy to resolve. However, it should be noticed that there was also an alternative way from Judea to Galilee, through the Jordan Valley. Thus, in John 4:4, the theological necessity is probably to be favored. It seems that the Syriac versions prefer rather the geographical interpretation of Jesus' necessity to pass through Samaria. This interpretation is very clear in the Syriac Sinaiticus. The readings of the Curetonianus and of the Peshitta are slightly more complicated. If it's true that the quoted versions speak of a kind of need for Jesus to pass through Samaria, it's actually true that an eventual modality expressed by Mavedavat le does not have the same value and force as that expressed by Ede. The verb day in the Gospel of John synthesis. As stated before, I would now like to propose a sort of summary that will illustrate the way of translating day in the Syriac versions under examinations. This short table allows us to point out different elements. First of all, the surgical precision of the Harklean versions that translates all occurrences of day with tzadek. This modus operandi makes this version almost useless for our research. So I will limit my consideration to the Old Syriac and Peshitta. In this version, the most frequent translation of day is wole. It translates occurrences of day that represent all categories. On the other hand, the use of atit is more limited and defined. The Peshitta translates all occurrences of day linked to the passion of Jesus with atit, whereas the Syriac Sinaiticus oscillates between fa, John 3:14, and atit, John 12:34 and John 29. As for the Curetonianus, only the text of John 3:14 with wole has survived. The case of John 3:14 is therefore particularly interesting due to a divergence between the Old Syriac and the Peshitta. This is a detail to keep in mind. First of all, considering, as pointed out by Brock, that I quote, the Peshitta New Testament is in fact not a completely new translation from Greek, but a revision of the Old Syriac, corrected it against the Greek text, end of quote. In this perspective, the shift from Kva, John 3:14 S, or wole, John 3:14 C, to atit, John 3:14 P, becomes even more significant. On the one hand, it may show an inner development of the Syriac language with a semantic refinement of the form atit and or a work of many translators. On the other hand, it renders Peshitta text more coherent, interconnecting all Jesus' passion references expressed by day. It is also curious to notice that when translating the occurrences of day link to religious obligations and to the Christian existence, the Syriac Sinaiticus completely leaves out its modal value. In some way, this obligation, as to speak, no longer appear necessary. The other occurrences of wole and atit in the Old Syriac and Peshitta. In order to make my analysis more accurate and complete, I will now briefly focus on the remaining occurrences of wole and atit in John's Gospel in the Old Syriac and Peshitta. The focus only on this version is due to the fact that in Euclid's edition of the Harklean version, as far as I know, the verb form vole is absent, whereas the form atit is used in a mechanical way, exclusively to translate all occurrences of mello. Trying to create a sort of bridge with the first part of my work, I will reuse as far as possible the previous categories. In the Old Syriac and Peshitta, atit often translates the Greek verb mello. Indeed, this is not surprising. At times, the meaning of the verbs day and mello is quite similar. This phenomenon, however, does not facilitate our research, since the semantic field of mello is not always easy to explore. The main challenge seems to be the possibility of a sharp distinction between its purely temporal sense, to be about, and its temporal modal aspect. We can read in Liddell Scott, to be destined rightly to, indicated as estimated certainty or strong probability in the present, past, or future. This kind of ambiguity makes mello similar to atit. Unfortunately, I cannot discuss the individual text in detail, so I provide you with a table that presents all the other occurrences of vole and atit in John's Gospel in the Old Syriac and Peshitta. It seems useful to start here with a numerical observation. The occurrences of vole, not linked directly today, are really very few, unlike those of atit, and are found only in the Syriac Sinaiticus. Obviously, is to be considered here the incomplete nature of the text of the Old Syriac, first of all of the Curetonianus. But let us get back to vole. In John 13:14s, it defines the attitude of Jesus' disciples, whereas in John 18:14s, the passion of Jesus. This last usage of vole recurs in some way John 3:14c, where Jesus speaks about the necessity of his passion using just vole. On the other hand, the presence of vole in John 18:14s creates quite interesting textual links in the Syriac Sinaiticus. In John 18:14, the narrator recalls Caiaphas' words of John 11:50, already interpreted in John 11:51 as prophecy. The Syriac Sinaiticus present in this text three different lexical choices, although in John 11:50 and John 18:14 appears the same verb synfero. The Peshitta gives the impression of being more coherent, choosing both in John 11:50 and in John 18:14 the same construction with mut and pkach. But it might be interesting to try to place those choices of the Peshitta in a broader context. As shown by the table that we can see, the Peshitta, for the necessity of Jesus' passion, usually almost exclusively uses atit. So, Caiaphas does not speak about Jesus' passion and its necessity or expediency as Jesus or the narrator does. It should be useful to point out that the ancient readers of the Bible normally didn't know the Greek text that their translation was based on. The impact of the text was therefore different. Recalling here the dynamics of the Syriac Sinaiticus, it seems possible to identify, almost for the reader, three lexical choices that reflect three different perspectives and somehow three different speakers. John 11:50s, Pkach plus mut, Caiaphas' speech about the expedience of Jesus' death. John 11:51s, atit plus mut, Caiaphas' speech interpreted as prophecy by the narrator. John 18:14s, vole plus mut, Caiaphas' speech recorded by the narrator. The perspective of the reader is also shaped by new compared to the Greek text textual links. Let us go back again to the table seen before. In the Old Syriac and Peshitta, the form atit frequently translates not only day but also mello, or in some cases is a kind of plus. Clearly, these phenomena are not equal in all versions. Nevertheless, this affirmation allows us to create a wider background for our analysis. Looking at our table, you can easily notice that the use of atit is not limited only to the concept of necessity of the patient, like the case of day, but involves also other concepts such as the mission of Jesus, the events of the end, and the mission of Jesus' disciples. In this manner, all these realities become interconnected in an original way. The concept of eschaton, expressed by atit, is clear in John 7:39 SCP and John 40:22 SCP. Maybe it's also possible to add John 16:13p, where the adjective atidata appears, which is a peculiar rendering of the Greek text. The two other texts to point out are John 11:27s and John 21:19p. In both texts, we find the form atid, which is in some way superfluous. All these examples show that atid is something more than a simple marker of the future, but it also contains a modal force within itself. The above-mentioned modal force of atid poses sometimes challenges on a theological level. Some occurrences of atid, classified as linked to Jesus' passion and its necessity, express indeed Judas' plan to betray Jesus, John 6:71 SCP and John 12:4p. In addition, in John 21:19, the Peshitta speaks about Peter's death, adding, as already pointed out, to the text atid. How to interpret these occurrences of they? Do they express a kind of deontic predetermination? In this context, it seems useful to consider the figure of the speaker. In the text under discussion, the narrator speaks and interprets the events and the temporal aspects. Using the syntagma temporal aspect, I mean a specific relation between the past time of the events described in the biblical text and the present time of the reader. The reader of the Bible is sure that the events defined by atid will happen, because many of them have just happened in the real story. Moreover, this fact makes certain eschatological events described by atid, but not yet realized. It suggests that the atid expresses rather epistemic modality and not the deontic one. Some conclusions. The verb day poses numerous challenges that mysteriously unite ancient and modern Bible translators. The latter are in some ways fortunate, as they can benefit from the work of their ancient colleagues. Indeed, ancient Bible versions can help us better understand the biblical text, especially when it is difficult and problematic. The case of the verb is certainly a good example. Of course, this type of assistance should not always be accepted uncritically. Even ancient Bible translators could have made mistakes or been incoherent. Sometimes perhaps we are unable to fully understand their choices, partly because the data we have is partial. It can be useful to recall here all the passages with the verb day that are not preserved in the Old Syriac. Maybe the present of this text would lead to slightly different research results than those presented. Another element that unites the work of ancient and modern translators is the concept of responsibility. Often, or rather normally, readers did not know in the past and still don't know today the original text, Hebrew or Greek, which their Bibles are based on. Each translator of the Bible offers his reader the same but also a different Bible, since it's impossible to reproduce all the phenomena of the text being translators. Some translators' choices may be of little consequences. Others, however, such as those involving complex words like they, can have a profound impact on the reader. This fact reminds us of the enormous responsibility of every translator of the Bible and biblical scholar. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very clear, very detailed, well-informed presentation. Now it's the time for discussions. So we've got Anna Rambier-Kwaśniewska, our colleague from Wrocław. Please go on to ask your question, Anna. Oh, that's actually clapping. It's not a question. It's an applause. It's a round of applause. So
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yes,
but-
it was clapping. Definitely.
okay, a round of
Very
applause.
nice.
All right. So thank you so much. Any other rounds of applause or questions? Do we have any questions for now? We do admire the presentation. That is not too technical, but right enough to be well informed. Now, I was wondering, and I was willing to ask this question to Father Tomasz before, but I'm gonna go on and ask it to you. It seems to be a very well informed, but also very highly literate ambience in which the translators of Vetus Peshitta are working. So how would you imagine their workplace actually, where they're surrounded with different copies of manuscripts, traditions they had an access to, and then carefully choosing also or weighing those translations in Greek, maybe in other Semitic languages, what would be the way they actually translated those texts in terms of manuscript culture is definitely a rich and very luxurious one. It's costly too. So I imagine those places where they worked being well equipped and pretty affluent also.
Thank you for your question. This question is not it's not easy, I think, because we need to consider a kind of, I can say, of development of the Syriac translations of the Bible of the New Testament. We can speak, I think, of a development from a reader-oriented translation to a text-oriented translation. After me, Piotr Jutkiewicz will speak about the Harklean version, so he knows better this issue, because the Harklean version is almost as I told, a mirror translation where the biblical text is translated word for word. The Old Syriac, or maybe the situation of the Old Syriac is more complicated from this point of view, because we need to distinguish different phenomena connected, linked to these translations. As pointed out by Tomasz Szymczak, when we try to analyze a specific passage of the Old Syriac, we need to consider almost three hypotheses: the translations hypothesis, the Vorlage hypothesis, and also the transmission hypothesis, because something could have gone wrong during the transmission of the text. So the short answer will be the following one. We have our translators. I can speak about the translator of the Old Syriac were persons who were trying to translate text very carefully, but on the other hand, there were not slaves by the Greek text. They tried to make text comprehensible for their readers. It is clear that in our text we can find traces of other manuscripts, other Syriac, other textual traditions. One aspect that is very peculiar are some connections, we can say, between the Western traditions and the Syriac translations. We have Syriac Semitics, we can say, text that contain some Western elements, aspects. So in the Old Syriac we can find very mysterious elements that we are not able to explain at all. Maybe Tomasz Szymczak would like to add something to my explanation.
If I can
Yes.
just,
Oh, thank you. We can enlarge
if
it.
I
Yes.
can just shortly, as we have seen, one of the main problems with the Old Syriac Gospels is the question if we can even speak about one Vetus Syra, because the differences between the version in Curetonianus and in the Sinaiticus are quite big. So we have no idea if there was only one revision of the Diatessaron, or if there are two independent revisions. As we have seen, nowadays there are new discoveries. For example, we have the discoveries in the palimpsest in the Vatican Library, so very fresh one, published 2 years ago by Gregory Kessel. So we are we are still trying to find out if we can even talk about the Vetus Syra, one unique translation, or about two different translations. So one represented by the Curetonianus, and maybe the version which we find in the Vatican Library, and the other one represented by the Sinaiticus. So going from here to the milieu, to the actual office with the papers, with the pergamena, with the papyr, I think it's totally impossible.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you. It's nice to listen to a discussion among the specialists. Still, they had to use some manuscripts, right? Or It seems like a literate culture, not so much the oral transmission. Anyway, thanks for both papers. Now we're going on to another presenter. I'd like to introduce Piotr Jutkiewicz, also a graduate from the Pontifical Biblical Institute 2023. The dissertation he wrote was titled The Gospel of John in the Harklean version, an edition based upon the earliest witnesses, and again, as the school of Professor Craig Morrison. He taught for a brief period of time at the Catholic Academy in Warsaw, and now he teaches at the Biblical. Congratulations. In Rome. He published multiple articles in Biblical Annals, Vox Patrum, Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Journal of Syriac Studies, Journal of Oriental Studies, participated in grants and research projects like the Editio Critica Major of the Greek Psalter, and is a stipendist of the Swenson Family Fellowship in Eastern Christian Manuscript Studies for Junior Scholars. He'll be presenting the paper titled Mirror Translation, How Should We Define It? Various aspects of the treatment of the Greek infinitive in the Gospel of John, according to the Harklean version. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you hear me well?